It's not common that my world gets turned upside down by whiskeys, but when it does, I think we should talk about it. So recently I was at another EBRA event. This was their 10-year anniversary, where some of their original founders, in fact the founding three, get together, and anyone who's invited gets to have some amazing whiskeys. Now, I produce a lot of whiskey. I'm around a lot of high-proof whiskey. But this tasting was something I've never experienced in my life. It put me into a zone where I was not comfortable. It really pushed the boundaries of my whiskey experience. And that is the topic of hazmat whiskeys. Now, I'm not talking about 65%, 120 proof hazmat whiskeys, or even 130 proof. I'm talking about 140 plus. Ridiculous amounts of alcohol to have in a glass. Now, these numbers are not unheard of. There are quite a few whiskeys out in the world, however, at very small amounts and quite hard to get your hands on, as were these. Things like Brudladik, X4. There's quite a few vodkas out in the world at over 80%, and makes sense. They're pretty pure. I guess they're just not watered down. Now, of course, there's legendary George T. Stagg releases at over 70%, but just barely. And even Jack Daniels has some releases which are over, released as recently as 2021. But what we got to try out were some super interesting and, again, mind-blowing Heaven Hill releases. In fact, we got to try 3 of them all in one night next to each other. Now, don't get me wrong, we did not dive into these whiskeys with nothing to set our palates before. There's of course an amazing lineup, and you slowly work your way up to the first whiskey, which was a measly 74%, 148 proof. What's amazing about this whiskey, it's only 15 years old, and actually 120 bottles of it actually got released. And it was distilled on January 30th, 1999. Now, all of these whiskeys had quite an interesting backstory about them. Essentially, one of the founders went to Kentucky, was visiting the distillery, and we're talking years ago, right? It's not like these days where you could walk in and buy a barrel. This was at a time when American bourbon whiskeys did not have the pull and the strength and the kind of like cult following that it has today. They walked in, they had a little tasting, tried some barrels, and were not very excited. In fact, they left without even picking a barrel. Always telling the staff there, we are looking for something amazing. We are looking for something completely different and mind-blowing. Now what's amazing is they left, and while they're driving away, they got a phone call. And it was nobody other than Mr. Shapiro himself, I believe Ed. And his words were something like this. Hey, I heard you guys are looking for something extremely rare and very different. I got something. Okay, hey. If the Shapiro family calls you directly, you turn around and you get your butt over there. And that's what they did. What they ended up taking was this barrel. And it's very interesting because, again, to get to 77 or anything over 65% alcohol, quite extreme. For those bourbon fans out there, you probably already know to be classified as bourbon or like American whiskeys, you do not go into the barrel at more than 62.5% alcohol, 125 proof. That's the legal limit. So when a whiskey comes out of the barrel at more ABV than that, it's actually quite crazy because that means that while this barrel was aging, it lost more water than it did alcohol. Now you might be thinking, that's impossible. I've heard and been on so many tours where I've been told about the angel share and that the angel share is such an amazing, beautiful thing where the angels take some of our whiskey. Yeah, that's in some climates. The weather has a huge role in this. When it's dry and warm, we'll take more water out of the barrel. Versus if it's humid, you're going to be losing more alcohol. Scottish lose alcohol, usually. Don't know what Brudladik did. And Americans in Kentucky, in Texas, tend to lose more water in these high climates. But that's not enough. Again, there's a lot of whiskey being aged in Kentucky that doesn't necessarily get this high in ABV. It has to be located in a very specific spot. In fact, these were not only aged at the top floors of a rickhouse, but they were at the very top in a little cathedral kind of opening. A little on top, like it's an extra room on top of the rickhouse. And that just further kind of brought in the heat and baked these whiskeys. Hey, the flavor explosion that goes through in your mouth is something undescribable. You gotta get your hands on something, or even just a little sample. Check out EBRA, talk to whoever you know that has a great whiskey connection. because you think hazmat's crazy, this stuff blows you away. Now, this was only the first in the lineup. As I said, there's 2 more. The second one was a 77.4 ABV. That's 154.8 proof. And this one was 23 years old. Hey, 23 years. Well, as you can imagine, there wasn't a lot of barrels, or you couldn't bottle a lot. This barrel was almost empty. So at that point, Heaven Hill was probably happy to get rid of it. In fact, to Switzerland, we only got 41 bottles of it. And finally, the one that to me was just craziest thing I've ever seen, 82.7% alcohol, 165.4 proof. Again, I'm around alcohol a lot. High proof. I sample it sometimes. But to sit there and have this in your glass and to take a sip and be overwhelmed, not burning, it's not like killing you inside, it kind of is, but it is so overwhelmingly flavored. It is so dense and compact that you take the littlest sip. I use the analogy, you gotta drink high proof whiskey like it's hot tea. This thing, you kind of just, it touched your lips and you got flavor. And when you had it coating your tongue, you kept it in there for a few seconds, just the evaporation off your tongue, the flavors kept coming. You could sip a little glass, like way smaller than that there, for probably 30, 40 minutes. And you are still getting a explosion of flavor each and every time that stuff even got close to your mouth or nose. This is pretty interesting because so much alcohol is quite hard to transport and even to sell at that proof. And of course, they didn't want to water this amazing spirit down. But when they were trying to import it into Switzerland, they had a problem. It turns out that in Switzerland, only the government is allowed to sell or kind of handle 80+ proof alcohol. And this being at 82%, okay, what can they do? Now, of course, very clever guys with a little bit of back dealing, they were able to convince them, hey, we're going to bring in some of these bottles, but we're not going to sell them. They're only for members of our Verein, of our club. And that's what happened. You can only get or taste some of this at EBRA. So if you're in the area, and I say this a lot, but I really mean it, check out EBRA, get in contact with me, get in contact with them directly. It's worth it. And to try stuff like what we tried before, I mean, forget the Heaven Hill for a second. I mean, the lineup is insane. You get to try different Dusties, Prohibition whiskeys for medical purposes only, and also things like Willer Family Estate single barrel pick rye. It's just best rye I think I've had tasting by far. It's just a shame that when you have such a ridiculous lineup, some things stick out more than others. And it's hard to compete with anything at 82 ABV. In fact, when I saw that, I didn't even think much of it. I thought, oh, okay, must be a Dusty or something, until it finally clicked in my head. We're not talking proof, we're talking ABV. Shoot. Hey, no matter how much alcohol you have in your glass, no matter if it's hazmat or normal, cheers to you, enjoy it, be safe and careful out there, especially with those crazy high ABVs. But if you can, take a sip and be overwhelmed like I was. Cheers. Bye now.